just want to welcome you on behalf of Fuller Seminary and Real Spirituality. We're going to be seeing a film called A Ghost Story, and afterwards there'll be a discussion with the director. So I think you're in for a really good night. So again, thanks for coming, welcome, and enjoy the film. This is David Lowery, the writer and director.
Thank you all for coming to check it out.
Before I sort of launch into content, I do have a question about the format.
Yes.
Why you picked that particular shape.
Of the frame itself?
Yeah.
As a fan of old movies, I've always liked the Academy ratio. And I've also really enjoyed seeing contemporary filmmakers use it. Because, you know, our screens now are all rectangles, whether it's here at the cinema or at home, and that creates a built-in proscenium when you look at a 1331 image. And so I like that. That just makes it looks nice to me. I like looking at things through things. I mean, there's other things, like I liked, you know, I felt it was appropriate for this movie because of the, you know, it's about someone who's basically trapped in a box for eternity. Sure. So thematically it works, but visually it felt right. And the curved edges made it feel nostalgic to me because I'm a sucker for nostalgia.
Yeah.
But you know, it's true. It does have like that sort of vintage quality. And we also always joke that it's the perfect shape to watch it on an Apple Watch. So the first movie ever watched on an Apple Watch.
It's really funny, but as I was saying, by the way, this is the only technical question I'll ask because I know nothing about film. So in terms of in technology, but it occurred to me that there was something about the film that lends itself to the future as much to the past in terms of the way you framed it and the way it's shot and the way it looks. But that's just me. I'm a bit of an Instagram fiend, so my life is in that kind of curved square box.
Same here. Yeah, it's weird how I thought that this movie would be really easy to shoot in that aspect ratio, partially because I'm just so used to framing things on Instagram. But then I realized afterwards that it was really hard to shoot it. Like it took us a long time to figure out how to frame things properly. And then I was like, oh wait, on Instagram I crop everything to a rectangle too. Exactly. So like I naturally think in widescreen. So this was a bigger challenge than I was expecting.
What I found most perhaps remarkable, or at least compelling for me, is I've spent the last couple of years really exploring the notion of ghosts in philosophy, in theology, in psychoanalysis, and it's interesting to me that we seem to be at a point in culture where there's a kind of renewed fascination with maybe the mysterious, maybe the mystical, not just the horror or the fantastic, but this kind of ghostliness, you know, haunted by lost futures, by lost pasts, by moments. And I wondered what your impulses were in terms of how you came to this story and what it means to you.
Well, to focus that question specifically into, you know, to focus it through the filter of making a ghost film.
Sure.
I have always loved the ideas of ghosts from when I was a little. I don't remember when my parents first introduced me to the concept of you know, ghosts and spirits and whatever, you know, the idea of hauntings. But it was early enough on that one of my earliest memories is my dad hiding under the staircase in our house and trying to scare me with the sound of banging on the walls. Like it was something that happened very early in my life. And so I've always, you know, loved horror films, and I've loved movies about ghosts and haunted houses, and I've loved going to haunted houses around Halloween time, and that's always been a big part of my life. But as I got older, I became very fascinated with the more philosophical ideas of it, and and also the practical ideas of it about whether or not this actually is what is actually going on when someone purports to have seen a ghost or experienced a haunting. What actually is going on, and what is that other presence that they are actually communicating with, or thinking that they're communicating with, if they're not actually communicating with anything. And I just started to I really enjoyed unpacking that.
Yeah.
And it adds, when you separate the ideas of spirits that are stuck here, for lack of a better way to describe it, when you separate that from the auspices of a horror film or from a scary movie or a scary story, there's something very compelling, very potentially very sad about that, very lonely, and it opens up a big can of worms in terms of questions about what happens next. And that was what was interesting to me.
I did connect with the kind of pathos, that the ghost is sort of trapped.
Yeah.
As much as we're trapped by the notion of ghosts, and that whole relationship between, the living, the not living, the existent versus the non-existent, and how they affect and interact with each other. And I don't know, I just thought it was a really tender approach. But how did you come to this particular story?
It is a very personal story in that it is based largely on a fight I had with my wife about moving.
Fair enough.
We were living in Texas and we were getting ready to move to Los Angeles for a film I was working on, and I really just did not want to leave. I was really hung up on leaving, and we did leave, and then I wanted to move back once we got here, and that's when the fight happened.
That happens to a lot of
people. And it was one of those fights that it was sort of it felt like a scene from a movie. It was one of those fights where you're like, I could see how this relationship, which is otherwise so wonderful and so agreeable, could potentially end if we push this all the way to the edge. That it's, we're walking up to a precipice right now of a real line in the sand.
Sure.
And we walked back because we didn't want that to happen. Yeah. But it felt like a scene from a movie. And being a filmmaker, I was like, well, that probably should be a scene from a movie. And so I wrote it down and didn't use it at first. I didn't use it right away, but within a month or two, I was writing this movie. And I mean, when I say writing this movie, it was only a 30-page screenplay, and 10 of those pages were this fight that is no longer really in the film. There's sprinkled throughout, yeah. But that's where it came from. Somewhere in there, the idea of a ghost wearing a sheet somehow got involved with that, and that was an idea that I did it because it made me laugh. But it made me laugh before I'd ever even thought of this movie. I had loved the idea of making a haunted house movie, or something like the Poltergeist or The Conjuring, but where the ghost was a spirit in a sheet, because I like taking symbols, and that's the universal symbol for a ghost. I like taking those symbols and sort of unpacking them, and on Snapchat, that's what the graphic for Snapchat is, or your emoji for a ghost on your iPhone.
Yeah, ghostly music.
Yeah, it's such a common thing that you don't really think about that image and what it actually represents anymore. And I love the idea of taking that image and this sounds sort of highfalutin, but restoring it to its intended meaning.
I mean, there is that kind of moment where you wonder what's going to happen, because the ghostly figure is so predictably, almost cartoonishly ghostly.
It's a real high wire act. I mean,
but I think it works kind of really, really well, because it dissipates certain other predictions that you'd expect around a story like this.
Exactly, it's not going to be scary,
and yet it kind of is in places.
In some places, yes,
I was,
but it's
I'm
not
worse.
scary. The ghost itself is not going to be scary.
No, the ghost,
and you sort of, he reminds me of Snoopy, and I think Snoopy did dress, or was it Linus and the Great Pumpkin dressed up as a ghost? But when you take a cartoon character and you distill their features down to the simplest, possible, symbols of features,
very iconic,
because that allows you to, convey emotion more clearly, and somehow just having those two holes in the sheet with,
no
darkness behind it, allowed a great deal of empathy and emotion to come through, and on set, we found ourselves getting very attached to him and very moved watching. We were always like, "Oh, he's so cute," but in a very sad way. We always felt very sad watching him just standing there in the corners. Yeah, it did run the risk sometimes of being too goofy, and we had to be careful about that. But if we knew if we walked that line, just so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that worked with the silent conversations between the ghosts. There was that kind of moment of levity where
we definitely want people to laugh. You want people to be able to laugh, but also never laugh at it.
Do you know this guy Mark Fisher, the writer Mark Fisher? He wrote this really fascinating book called Ghost of My Life. And he's a kind of music journalist, cultural analyst. And he wrote this book, and it's the subtitle is about hauntings and depression and other things that haunt us. And he uses actually post-1990s electronica as a kind of metaphor and a symbol for the hauntings of early 21st century life, that the very nature of like EDM and electronic music has this haunting of a society that's lost its future. And when he plays the song to his wife, that those dissonant sounds and the crackle that you hear in dance music, I thought, oh, so there's multiple layers of ghostly haunting going on here, past, present, and future, in a profound way. So I was really, really kind of moved.
I love that. I love the idea of those echoes, and like that that a haunting can be defined by more than just a literal presence of a spirit, but that it can be.
Yeah, well, because we don't know, do we?
We don't.
Over and over, regardless of how technologically advanced we presume to be, globally, we have these instances of ghostliness, the wondering of what happens when somebody dies. Where do you come from with all of those notions?
When it comes to the big questions, I don't know. And I think that's where all of this comes from. The fact that we don't know. We can have faith, or we can reject faith, or we can be incredibly pragmatic and scientific about everything, but there's just too much that we just can't wrap our heads around. Yeah. And maybe someday we will. Maybe we will be able to at some point. But right now, we're as much in the dark as we were centuries ago. And so the same questions persist, and the same sort of like fumbling in the dark persists. And out of that fumbling in the dark, these ideas emerge, and they are, incredibly common across all cultures, because I think we're all dealing with the same big questions.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, again, in the times in which we live, is it seems to me that there's a very clear sense for a lot of people that answers that we used to find helpful aren't as helpful anymore.
Absolutely, yeah, that's very true.
And yet, and so we go back to ask the same questions. Maybe we get some of the same answers, or maybe we're at a point where the answers aren't as important as actually the nurturing and the guarding of the questions itself about what these things might mean or do.
I would agree with that 100%, because the answers that once gave me solace as a child and when I was growing up no longer do.
Yeah.
And because they don't, it would be really easy to stop asking questions. But I feel like if I did stop asking those questions, a little light would go off in my life. And the need to have some degree of mystery that I'm still curious about, having that curiosity makes living my life better, even though I don't have the answers that I thought I once did.
And here we are, making room for this questioning of the nature of reality, and just sort of fumbling around, a bit like the ghost, scratching at that wall, trying to get to that piece of paper that you never get to see. I mean, that to me was the metaphor for the film. It's like scratch away at that as much as you like, but But so I don't need a film to mean anything, much as the way I don't really need life to mean anything. You know what I mean? I don't think you can find that overarching meaning. But I wonder what you might want to say about intentions or desires. Maybe desire is a better word. Desires that you wanted to explore, and desires perhaps that you think you captured.
I think this movie is an approximation of my own. I'm going to use the word fumbling again, but I was fumbling for some form of comfort at one point in my life not too long ago, where I felt out of sorts and unsure of. I felt like I was no longer had any sense of purpose in what I was doing. And I, as many of us do, spent a lot of long nights awake staring at the ceiling, just thinking about things, just thinking about everything.
Yeah.
Whether it was this house that I had left behind in Texas that I really was missing, or my place in the universe and what happens after we die. So it was all of these things wrapped up in, just the great sense of questioning that, again, I think we all experience in one form or another at various points in our lives. And I was getting very stressed out by it. And I'm a pretty chilled out person most of the time. So the fact that I was getting stressed out and feeling very nihilistic about life. And that's not a happy place for me to be. I don't like that.
Is that why Nietzsche came off the shelf with the other books?
That was pure accident. And I almost wish it hadn't, because it's so obvious. It's it's so on the nose, but we were just like...
I was glad it didn't open to
Yes,
Nietzsche,
exactly.
Though,
in that case, it was... We had a bunch of books,
yeah.
and every take we'd do, we'd just randomly put them back up there again, and then I was like, oh man, that's front and center, isn't that? And I was like, oh well, whatever. But it's... I was really afraid that the Gabriel Garcia Marquez book would be like more front and center, because like that one's very obvious, but that one you can barely see. So this movie was not, there was intention behind every scene and everything that happens. Like when we cut from one scene to the next, I had a reason for it, and it was very intentional, and that ripples back to the script and then forward to like where we'd put the camera on the day when we were shooting that scene.
Yeah.
Everything was intentional, and at the same time, I didn't set out trying to achieve any one thing. As you say, like you can't really like defining the movie as a movie with an answer or an end goal in sight. That wasn't my plan making this. I was really just trying to explore a bunch of things that were troubling me and explore them through various aesthetic means that intrigued me or that I was curious about. And I didn't hope to arrive at an answer at the end of it, but I hoped to arrive at some greater sense of clarity in my pursuit of answers, which inevitably will last my entire life. So it was like, that's kind of what it is.
And did that work?
Yeah, I found that when I was, you go through production of a film and you just can't see the forest for the trees, and just as everything feels like a terrible nightmare. So it wasn't until, I want to say last December, when we finally had the edit in a pretty good place, and I sat down and watched it, and for the first 40 minutes or so, I'm watching it on a very technical level.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, okay, the sound's at the right levels. We need to make a little tweak to the color correction.
Yeah.
And around 40 minutes in, I forgot to keep watching the movie in that fashion. And I, for the first time in my life, was able to watch something I've made in an objective fashion. And I got to the end and didn't know what we'd made and didn't know what to feel, but I felt very comforted. I felt at peace.
Yeah.
And it made me feel better about things. And I could unpack that. I could start saying why did it, but I'm choosing not to at the moment, because it's such a wonderful place to be as a filmmaker.
And probably best not to.
It's best, I think it's best not to. I try not to self-analyze too much.
Yeah.
And so for once I was able to make something that made me feel good.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm going to hang on to as long as I can.
So the guy in the kitchen, fantastic. But he goes off on his, and we've probably all been at late night parties where that's gone on. You know what I mean?
There's one guy who's got this,
especially in LA. There's always one person with a kind of conspiracy view of the world that just kind of works.
Yeah.
But how much of that is, I guess, what you feel, or was that just a distraction from what you feel? Does that make sense?
No, it is 100% what I felt when I wrote it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't go all the way. he's defining things in black and white terms.
Yeah.
In order to break down, to provide the points of discussion.
Sure.
And I feel like he never quite gets to the gray area that you need to get to actually arrive at some sort of resolution.
Yeah.
And
that's an interesting.
And that gray area is where I feel I am at now.
Yeah.
And yet everything he's presenting in this argument it was an argument I was having with myself. I was like, okay, if I'm going to, here's how do I define my own set of standards by which I need to live my life to feel like I am living life to the fullest and not in a nihilistic sense.
Yeah.
And to do that, I have to confront a certain degree of nihilism head on and find its antithesis within it. And so he takes it to a certain point, and then people at the party stop listening to him. So he stops. Sure. He gets kind of bummed out.
Which tells you a lot. Which should be a good reminder to all of us that that once you start postulating, you lose your audience.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that we felt like the movie. It is easy to. I get caught up in it. He's a wonderful performer.
Yeah.
And then at a certain point, it just kind of dies away.
Yeah,
as happens.
Well, yeah, because the longer he goes.
Yeah, you kind of we cut to a couple people's faces and we're like, is he still talking?
We've all been there.
Yes, and I love that. I mean, it's really funny to me, but also truthful. Like there is truth in what he's saying, and it means something. It's very meaningful to me.
So then the scene with the family.
Yeah,
what was that about?
Well, it served two functions for me.
Yeah,
the one on a very surface level was that I wanted to have a sequence in the movie that felt like a classic haunted house movie, and yet you see the ghost the whole time. So almost every scene in there.
Although it did make me laugh when that one tin pot hit the wall and it just made that doink.
Oh yeah, we all laughed on set when that happened.
Okay, good.
It was amazing. So I kind of in the script there were more of those sequences. There was a creaky attic scene. There was I just wanted to have like a version of Poltergeist with a family moving into a new house that's haunted. And kind of fall back on a lot of those Spielbergian tropes, like the little kids who are looking wide-eyed at something that may or may not be there. And yet from the ghost perspective, since we've been aligned with him for that whole time, I wanted him to be upset. I wanted him to be angry and throw a temper tantrum like a little kid, because here's someone who has defined themselves by their attachment to this house.
Yeah.
And 50% of that attachment was to another person who's now gone. And so now all they have left is this house. And he's realizing, or he hasn't realized yet, but the house doesn't belong to him. It's just a space.
Yeah.
And he needs to, and his journey over the course of the movie is letting go. But right now he's still thinking that this is his space and that he needs to, define it as his own. So he throws a fit. And I love that it's like a little kid's temper tantrum.
Yeah.
And I love at the end, instead of going the Poltergeist route with the family moving out, the mom just sort of looks at him in the same way that she would look at her children.
Yeah.
And to me, I read it as like a little, he's shamed in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for a faceless entity, there's an awful lot of good acting going on.
Exactly. No, it's like he the moment's over, the scary moment's over. It's very violent and jarring, but then it's over. And he just looks at what he's done and is like,
you almost get the droop-shouldered.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she just cleans up and doesn't leave. And obviously they do move on because the next time we see them, it's a new family living there. But that was the idea there, was to take a classic Spielbergian haunted house movie scene, but imbue it with some sense of progress.
The ray gun was very Spielbergian.
Totally.
All right, and then maybe we'll make this the last question, really. The whole journey begins with your attachment to this house.
Yeah.
What was that attachment? I mean, can you talk about that?
Yeah, because I have thought about that. I remember moving out of the house, laying on the floorboards because our bed was already packed up in the moving truck, just wondering why I was so emotional about this house.
Yeah.
And part of it was that I liked it. It felt like my home. It was just a rental. It wasn't something we'd invested any time or money into, but it was the first house that my wife and I had moved into after we got married. And so there was some sentimental value there. And then I realized that I've felt that way about every home I've lived in. And that hasn't been that many, because I was raised in a very stable household
Yeah.
Like my parents, I'm the oldest of 9 kids. We had a big house. It was like a very
Excuse me, 9 kids.
Yeah,
Wow.
it was a very like they it was a very classic family unit that we had.
Yeah.
And aside from the sheer size of it, I guess it's slightly out of the ordinary in some circumstances. But I remember moving out of the first house we ever moved out of when we moved from Wisconsin to Texas when I was 7 years old and feeling the same way.
Yeah.
And I think it's because my parents just instilled in us this sense of safety within the domestic world that they had established for us.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to recreate that ever since. And I have. Everywhere I go, I just sort of like plant very deep roots very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And I attach myself to things in a very sentimental fashion, in a very nostalgic fashion, in an attempt to kind of recreate that wonderful little house that I grew up in Waukesha, Wisconsin. So
Yeah.
that I think is what it is. Like without having gone to therapy or gone to get psychoanalyzed, that's kind of what I assume it is. It seems pretty obvious to me. And I'm just trying to hold on to something beautiful that my parents gave me when I was very young.
Yeah.
And so as I move forward in life, I'm aware of that. I'm not trying to run away from it, but I'm also aware that it can hold me back sometimes. And the fact
Which is kind of a haunting in and of itself, right?
100%.
Yes. I mean, that whole notion that, ghosts, they either hold us back or we come to terms with who they are or what they represent and learn to live with them, but they never really go away.
That's exactly right.
That's it's an unhomely feeling. It's a strange feeling, and that the remedy really is to start to feel at home in a house that creaks, in a place where doors. I don't know. Anyway.
Which I subscribe to. I welcome
good.
that in my life. My wife and I, a good cap for that is that we actually just bought a house and or are about to, and it's a very creaky old house, and we went into it and realized that's why we loved it. So it's got lots of little hidden doors and things that are inevitably going to go bump in the night there.
Anyway, I just want to say thank you so much for the film. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
And I hope it finds a space to haunt a lot of people, because I think there's a lot there to take away. And thanks for taking the time to come and talk to us.
It's absolutely my pleasure.
Really been fantastic. And thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you all.
And thanks A24 and Fuller and Real Spirituality. And good night.
Good night indeed.
Thank you so much.